my name's Andrew Studd. I'm one of the partners in the charity team here at Russell-Cooke, and I'm joined by Gareth, one of my colleagues who's a senior associate who will help work through these slides. And it's a great pleasure to welcome Jonathan Orchard from Vincent, who we've done a number of these things with and worked on a number of mergers together. And always brings an interesting insight to merger dynamics. So thank you very much for joining us. I hope this will be useful. Today we're slightly focusing a little bit more about the dynamics and the energy around charity mergers rather than the processes. I think that's the one thing Jonathan and I have learned over the years, that actually the legal and accounting things are necessary evils, but the really tricky thing is getting these things off the ground and keeping them going, and the sensitivities. Jonathan will talk more about obstacles, but and Gareth will, before I start talking over Gareth's slide, he'll give you some background and some context about mergers in the sectors. Please do pop questions in the Q&A chat box, and we'll try and pick them up as we go through. We will keep recording at the end to try and pick up a few questions so that it's on the recording, but we'll then stop the recording if anyone's got any sort of sensitive questions they might want to ask. Please do so, but the more we can get you engaged with this rather difficult format, it would be great. So your questions will be very welcome. And I think that's probably it, Gareth, so I will hand over to you, if I may.
Perfect, thank you. So we wanted to put this discussion into context and to talk a bit about the pandemic and the effect that has or hasn't had on charity mergers to start with. So, of course, the context everyone's been operating in for the last couple of years is the pandemic, and hopefully now coming out of the pandemic. And I'm sure you'll all remember that at the outset, there were some very severe concerns being articulated for the sector. So, serious financial pressures predicted, perhaps worrying numbers of insolvencies and closures predicted. And then, although of course there has been a massive unprecedented effect as a result of COVID-19, the picture perhaps calmed a little bit over the next 2 years, and perhaps there weren't as many insolvencies as was worried about at the outset. And we also wanted to say that, of course, it's such a mixed picture because the sector is so large and so diverse that it's very hard to say, here's the one effect on the entire sector, because different organisations clearly had very different experiences. For example, a grant-making trust with a big pot of investments was hopefully not affected too much, whereas a big charity with lots of staff and services that relies on public fundraising and doesn't have a particular link to the NHS might have felt those effects much more keenly. There are some stats up there from the Charity Commission. So they were released in autumn 2021, I think as a result of their research and insight from the summer of 2021. And again, clearly, we wanted to say 170,000 registered charities. This isn't necessarily a comprehensive analysis of what all of those will be feeling, but it's a few numbers that are perhaps useful just to get some thoughts flowing. So 90% of charities experiencing some negative impact from the pandemic. I actually might have thought that would be even higher. 60% seeing a loss of income, roughly the same number anticipating some level of threat to financial viability over the next year. But at the point that this set of statistics was put together, only 1% saw that threat as critical to survival. And the Commission also noted in their comments on these statistics and this research that the number of charities closing at that point hadn't varied significantly compared to the previous year. And although insolvencies were up by a third, it's still only a total number of 97, which in the context of 170,000 charities is still a pretty small number, which is obviously a good thing. So clearly negative impacts coming out of the pandemic, but perhaps not as severe when looked at as a whole across the sector as we were initially worried about. There's then a question, though, about whether some of this is going to play through in the years to come. So combined with that, those initial predictions of how tough things were going to be for charities, there was a thought that that might mean there would be some more rescue mergers between charities trying to save staff services and provide for beneficiaries by consolidating. But actually, as many sector commentators have noted during the pandemic and still at the moment, the number of charity mergers has seemed fairly steady. So we wanted to talk briefly about why that might be and whether that's a trend that's going to continue now and in the future, or whether there may be some more mergers to come. One of the thoughts that we had was strategic mergers, where there might be a case for doing something in the strategic long term, probably were put on hold during the pandemic, because you're going to be in crisis mode, focusing on what you need to do right now to keep going and keep surviving. So some of those more strategic mergers might have been put on hold. Clearly, there was some government support for charities, which was very helpful for some charities, and also a great deal of resilience in the sector, which is to be applauded. And related to that, perhaps a traditionally cautious approach by some trustees to reserves and reserve policies actually helped during this time. Lots of charities have dipped into their reserves though, so some of those funds will be depleted. And again, that might play through in years to come. A quick note on the stats was just lots of charity mergers are sometimes finalised or announced in March or April kind of time to align with the financial year for a lot of charities. So sometimes there's a little uptick around that part of the year. But one of the things I suppose we wanted to open for discussion and to talk about was whether it's not necessarily the case that the number of charity mergers are steady now and they'll continue to be steady. It might be that we thought there were going to be more charity mergers, and that could still be the case as the financial impact of the pandemic plays through in years to come. And on that note, I wondered if Jonathan might want to jump in with his financial expertise, and have you got any comments on that, Jonathan?
Yeah, thank you, Gareth, and good morning, everybody. I think looking at this, as I inevitably do, I guess, with a financial hat on, certainly some of the conversations I've had with clients in the last few weeks actually has been quite a recent trend that I've just been observing, though, with real concern that, okay, we got through the pandemic period and yeah, maybe we drew down a bit on reserves, but we have the reserves, and you know, they're there for a rainy day and it's never been rainier, and etc. But actually, looking at the funding environment going forward, and particularly those charities with significant proportions of government funding, central government funding, I think are hearing some very worrying messages coming out of their relevant government departments about the landscape going forward. So I think that as a driver going forward, I think there is more concern out there now about what the longer term funding situation might be.
Yeah, so I guess it could be that some of those strategic mergers put on hold come off hold, and there are perhaps a need for some more rescue mergers. I suppose we all hope not, but we'll have to wait and see. So with that background, I think that's all for that one. We'll move on and talk about why we think mergers are worth considering and some of the key considerations around them. I think that one is over to you, Jonathan, now.
Over to me, yeah. Thank you, Gareth. So yeah, we just put some bullet points on here as to why merge. I think I would just qualify all that by saying, certainly from my perspective, but I think Andrew and Gareth share this perspective, that we're not here to say every charity should be merging or there's too many charities. It's not part of that sort of agenda here. For me, this is something that every charity should be considering, particularly in light of where we've been over the last couple of years, you know, whether there is a better way of delivering for that charity's beneficiaries than has been the case previously. So is there a better way going forward of structuring our work, of which one option might be to merge? And I know Andrew's going to come in on what some other alternatives might be to that in a moment. But in terms of some of those merger drivers, that are on that slide. I mean, the first three on there, geographical spread, reach, more efficient service delivery, reduce overhead, cost savings, etc. They are all, for me, they're all part of the economies of scale argument for a merger. But at the same time, I would qualify that by saying bigger doesn't necessarily make for better. And you stick you have a large unresilient charity and you've got more problems than if you had a small unresilient charity, frankly. So the key question from an economies of scale and trying to deliver those sorts of cost and efficiency benefits is in becoming bigger through a merger, do we realise or do we release more resource to put to the social impact, to put to public benefit? That has to be the test there, rather than just an automatic assumption that bigger is better. We've got future funding uncertainties on there, which references to the previous discussion we've just been having. But obviously income diversification has become such a critical strategy in light of where we've been, and particularly those who were reliant on those sorts of fundraising streams that did stop in the pandemic, sort of community events and that kind of thing. Recognising the need to be drawing on a wider range of income sources, and whether a merger can help you tap into that. Brand and cost of fundraising is really whether through a merger you can sort of double down. We know how expensive, particularly if you're in the public fundraising arena, and therefore, if there's an organisation with a stronger brand that you can couple up with, can you exploit and double down on the value in their brand to the benefit of your charitable work? And similar argument around the voice in campaigning. In being bigger, can you shout louder and make the case for your beneficiaries better in that way? Then the next two grants from this sort of the changes in the funding landscape again. The moves from grants to larger commercial contracts, which we saw a few years ago and then probably went a bit on pause. Well, might that come back again with the need for public finances to ensure that they're delivering a necessary return? And payment by results contracts, we know require significant amounts of working capital. They do require scale to be effective. But we're also seeing funders asking for more partnership working. There were funders looking to get for their money to go further. And therefore, and I'm certainly working on a couple of mergers at the moment where one of the drivers is actually coming from funders wanting organisations to be working more closely together. Then there's other factors, governance factors, board succession. Has the board sort of run itself up to a dead end? Can't that board go any further? Might a merger make sense from a governance perspective? Access to staff skills and having the career progression that a larger organisation might have. Then would that happen in staff? Improve staff retention, etc. All of those factors above, for me, are all resilience factors. They're all things that make an organisation more resilient going forward. The final one is around merger out of a crisis, and I think all the above ones, because are the opportunity gains that can be had out of a merger, but too many mergers that we see are born out of crisis, and very often financial crisis. And Andrew, I think, is going to pick up on some of those factors around rescue mergers.
Yeah, so you'll have heard rescue merger. They're what gives the word takeover a bad name when you talk in charity merger terms. Nobody wants to be seen to take over. But trustees know that they have duties towards their charities. One of those duties is to ensure that it remains solvent. It's also a real concern for many trustees if they are a trustee of a small charity that's becoming insolvent and they are working in a bank or a regulated business, because that causes them considerable problems in their day-to-day activities. You will have seen the kids company judgment, no doubt, which on one hand gives a lot of comfort to trustees that the position we thought was the case, that trustees would be treated kindly by the court, as it were, was reaffirmed. But there's also an underlying current in there that they didn't actually test the wrongful trading matter, because the way the official receiver brought the case was not testing that point. So it's really important for trustees in the main to ensure that the charity that they are a trustee of stays solvent. It creates all sorts of difficulties if it goes from solvent to insolvent. Just a reminder, the insolvency test comes in two ways. One is the inability to pay your debts as they fall due, so the cash flow test, and one is where the liabilities exceed the assets. You can quite often, or you can sometimes, trade through the second one where liabilities exceeds assets. It's usually the first one, the cash flow test, that causes the problem. And the problem for trustees is that they can be held personally liable to contribute to the assets of an insolvent charity if they are found guilty of wrongful trading. Wrongful trading is where the trustees or the directors knew or ought to have known that they couldn't avoid insolvent liquidation, and at the same time didn't do everything they possibly could to act in the best interests of their creditors. So, provided at the moment you understand you are potentially insolvent, that you change from trying to deliver your objects to looking out for the interests of creditors, i.e. minimising, not increasing the level of debt the charity has, you're probably going to be okay, but it is not a nice place to be. And when you are beginning to think that money is tight, trying to rescue the situation by way of a merger is obviously more difficult, because decisions need to be taken quickly, as Jonathan will come through on about some of the dynamics of getting a merger. It takes time to identify people and work a business plan and justify it and get everybody to agree to it. So really, you need to be well ahead on your finances, getting regular financial information to make sure you can avoid insolvency. Rescue mergers tend to occur before insolvency. The reason for that is that it's not possible when you are potentially insolvent to just give away your assets in the way you might do in a normal charity merger. In a normal charity merger, you give away assets and liabilities. But if you've got more liabilities than assets, it does become difficult, because a partner is not going to want to take on more liabilities than assets, but they can't take just the assets, because that would be what's called a transaction at an undervalue. And it's possible for a liquidator to reverse that transaction for 2 years following it. So it brings even more uncertainty. So one of the ways that rescue mergers are done, and we'll come to structures, we're trying not to do too much about structures, but is for rather than a partner organisation or a merger partner assuming assets and liabilities, leaving the legal entity behind, but just taking certain assets and liabilities, it is for the merger partner to become the sole member of an organisation, so that where you have a limited liability organisation, the member does not become liable for the debts, but it allows the merger partner to take control and consider how it will restructure and fund the organisation going forward. So usually that's a way. It is also possible, and we did this, Gareth and I worked on a major project for 4 children, where they saw quite some distance out that some of their contracts were not going to be renewed, that put them in a difficult cash flow situation. And we used what's called a pre-pack. So we put it into administration, and then the administrator transferred bits of business with assets and liabilities out. And we managed that way to save lots of the services. Because clearly, if you just close down, you lose valuable assets and you lose exciting projects. So they are a possibility. They're fraught with some difficulties, but they clearly benefit the sector if you can preserve assets, preserve projects, and keep people, keep beneficiaries supported. So I think that's all I wanted to say on that, Gareth. Alternatives to mergers, me again. So there are clearly lots of alternatives to mergers. I won't spend a long time on this. I think the issue we want to draw out here is actually, it's again about timing and partnership and being aware of who is out there and who can help you in circumstances. And it again depends what the driver for seeking some form of collaboration actually is. There are plenty of informal arrangements and networks, the NCVOs of this world, where they share information and training, the BOMs in the international development sector. Resource sharing arrangements, we're seeing increasing numbers of there, where a merger will be potentially on the cards, but initially people are providing back office services, for example, to each other. They're not always ideal because you tend to have to pay VAT on back office services. So 20% of your cost is going to be VAT, which you probably want to avoid. I'm a trustee of a charity which is spawned from a charity in Australia which works in Cambodia, and we're forever swapping people, as it were, so that our fundraiser can work on a fundraising project in Australia. Their accounts person can help us produce our accounts here, and they're appropriately cross-charged and monitored, but it is a very effective way of, so we don't have to have a finance person here. We can borrow their finance from Australia. Prime and subcontractor arrangements are more arm's length and dictated, if you see what I mean, more formal arrangements whereby one party asks another party to deliver certain services on its behalf. It may be supporting groups of service users with a different type of service. So people in a residential home, there might be other services they need from external. Joint ventures, again, they seem they're another step along the continuum of collaboration. Can be just a joint venture, a bit like a prime subcontractor arrangement, where you have a contract in place to say who's going to do what. You perhaps have a steering committee to work out where the collective will go. Equally, you can set up a new entity which has a separate legal life of its own, but is controlled by the partners through their membership and their role on the board of directors, if that's the structure being used. Again, that sort of relationship takes a lot of time and energy. Collaboration, I think, is one of the things that people always say is it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of commitment, it takes a lot of goodwill to keep these things going, which is why merger actually is sometimes a better, quicker, less painful approach. We'll all be aware of the affiliated structures and the federated structures, the mines, the MENCAPs. Even amongst them, I think we're seeing some consolidation, partly driven by contracts that say we need you to do the whole of London or the whole of the Southwest or whatever it may be. And each individual organisation, if it's limited too tightly to a geographical area, finds that it can't deliver that contract. So I think there's certainly more collaboration amongst them to deliver those contracts, and some mergers. And also, just to mention demergers, I mean, some organisations are finding that because they don't necessarily have the free resource to support particular projects, if they've got a real flagship project and they want to protect it and they want to give it life of its own, spinning it out or demerging it from the main charity, putting it into a separate charity or similar structure so that it can survive and thrive on its own, is another approach we're seeing people look at. So I think then I just wanted to give people a picture of what we talk about when we're talking about charity mergers, because they do come in various shapes and sizes. The two main ones is where you do a transfer of assets and liabilities from one to another. So here I've got charity B transferring its assets to charity A, leaving a bigger charity A. Sorry for my PowerPoint, it's terrible, isn't it? I should do better. But charity A with charity B incorporated in it. As part of that, charity B will want to ensure that its assets are assumed by, its liabilities are assumed by charity A. Otherwise, it will be left insolvent and we'll be back in the situation we were referring to earlier. So usually they do that by charity A indemnifying charity B against any potential liabilities that may come in, perhaps subject to a financial cap. The next one is a very similar concept, is you set up a new charity and you have the charity A and the charity B transfer into that. My personal view is that that's a quite expensive way of doing it, because you've got to set up the new charity. You've got two sets of due diligence, because the new charity wants to understand both charity A and charity B's situation. And you've got 3 boards of trustees to convince that this is the right thing to be doing. It avoids the perception of takeover, but my personal view is that you should be able to do that with comms rather than legal structures. There may be other good reasons to do it, and Jonathan may have some views on that later. The next one is, again, this does depend a little bit on the legal structure of the entities involved. This structure assumes that the subsidiary charity is a limited liability vehicle of some description. It might be a CIO, it might be a company limited by guarantee, it could be a community benefit society. But they have 2 layers of governance: members and trustees. The point of this is that what you do is you change your articles of association, or you resign your current members and you insert a new parent charity as the sole member of the subsidiary charity. That way the parent charity has the control of the board of directors. It has the right to appoint and remove the board of directors, and therefore that further options for restructuring the subsidiary charity, if it's a rescue merger, or for ultimately combining the 2 operations at a slightly more gradual process. So, for example, subsidiary charity has a contract that's got a year to run, and you know that the local authority, whoever it may be, won't want to transfer that contract to another person because they won't want to go through procurement or more due diligence or whatever it may be. So you just leave it there for the year until that contract expires, and then that's the opportune moment to do the merger. And then I think there's just one more, of course. Oh, there should be a little line down to charity B as well. Again, similar to the earlier proposal, where you set up a new charity and it becomes the parent of charity A and charity B. Again, there are, I think Jonathan will talk about some of the advantages of some of these structures, which I have historically always thought, is that really the right thing to do? But increasingly, I can see some justifications, again, on time grounds, for thinking about some of these structures. But on that point, I think I'm handing back to Jonathan. Oh no, it's me again. Sorry, I got the first 2. So barriers to merger. Charities have obviously got to have compatible objects if they're going to work together, so that they don't have to cross-charge. It is actually quite a challenge. I was talking in relation to international development organisations not so long ago, and I did a little check down the Charity Commission's register, and some international development organisations are set up with religious purposes, some to advance the Islamic faith, some to advance the Christian faith. Others are set up to work in particular countries. Some are doing health, some are doing education, some are working with particular groups of people. So you do need to be very careful about checking your objects before you go too far down the road. But the Commission will help bring organisations' objects together, but they can't change an apple into a pear, as it were. So you do need to think about that. Legal structure, again, I think we've probably touched on this as to how you want to do it. The timing is, I think, important. So going back to the last structure where we had a parent charity and two subsidiary charities, that if you are going to bring two charities together and you're doing all your legal due diligence, you're checking out the financial due diligence, you're approaching landlords for consent to transfer properties and assign contracts, etc. That's going to take a long time, generally speaking, and it's going to cost a lot of money before you actually get anything done. So there are some good justifications for thinking, okay, if we were to just put a new charity on top, take control, start extracting some benefit early on, it may compensate for the additional cost of setting up a new charity. I'm going to not say any more of that because I know Jonathan will probably have some insights on that from a financial perspective. Trustees and staff. This is all about passion. This is all about ego. This is all about day jobs. So clearly, people don't become trustees unless they are passionate about the particular organisation. But sometimes that can be blinding if it comes to the future. People get very attached to particular brands, to the importance they feel of being a trustee of a well-known organisation. And of course, staff are always going to be concerned that if you bring two CEOs together, two FDs, two marketing directors, etc., that there will be rationalisation. So you really need to have a vision that is strong, that explains to people what the benefit of this combination is going to be. Again, that probably leads into Jonathan, I think, who's going to do the next 4 bullet points.
Thank you, Andrew. Yeah, I mean, I think the overriding thing in terms of the barriers, or not the barrier themselves, but how to overcome them, is that convincing business case, the convincing why is this the right thing to do? What are the benefits we're going to derive? What are the benefits our beneficiaries are going to see as a result of the merger? Because I think if you can be clear about that, then you can convince the people that you need to convince and bring them on board. But I think just to pick up on trustees, just one other thing I would say from my perspective on that is that too often trustees see merger as a failure. They see it as, okay, well, we can't deliver, therefore we've got to join forces with somebody else. But actually, if you can change perceptions and say, look, actually, in agreeing to this merger and supporting this merger process, we are safeguarding the charitable work our charity is doing for the future, then that is a success. So it's all about perception and how you position it. I think that is the key to overcoming some of these barriers. Language and culture, I mean, Andrew's touched on the merger. Is it a merger or is it a takeover? Does it matter? We've got to try and get through and above the terminology and focus on the benefits that are being derived and what each party to the merger stroke takeover brings, because even if it is a big charity taking over a small charity, or it's a strong charity taking over a weaker charity, there is something that weaker stroke smaller stroke being taken over charity brings to the piece. And it's about clearly articulating what that organisation brings and what can be retained post-merger that is specific about that organisation, the beneficiaries it reaches, the way it works, whatever it might be, and demonstrating how that will continue post-merger. So I think we've got to move beyond the merger or takeover language. And the culture piece, I mean, having seen merger discussions break down over disagreements over culture and ways of working, is so frustrating, I think, because yes, you've got to have the ability to work together. The two organisations are going to have to work together. But most importantly is the values and the focus on the beneficiaries. And that it's not about you as an organisation, it's not about you as a board of trustees or you as a senior management team. The perfect fit probably isn't out there, but good enough might have to do. remembering the responsibilities that this is all about, how we deliver to the beneficiary group, not retaining jobs, pride in trustees, etc. Brand implications, yeah, absolutely. Putting two organisations together, maybe one has a much stronger brand than the other. You've got to look into what brand's going to work best in the market going forward. I mean, there was the classic, the case of bringing two brands together in the merger that formed Click Sargent, for example. However many years ago that merger now was first formed, but it was an organisation called Click and it was an organisation called Sargent Cancer for Children. They joined forces, stuck the two brands together, operated as that joint brand for probably around about 15 years, very successfully, but have now just rebranded into Young Lives versus Cancer. That's the new name. But they just put those two brands together and created a new brand. So you've got to look into that and decide, well, we need some clarity. The one thing you don't want around a brand is a fudge, essentially. So some clarity on brand. Supporters, I'm thinking volunteers, I'm thinking about individual givers, I'm also thinking both about institutional donors. Supporters, volunteers and individual giving are very focused to the brand, particularly if you've got like a local charity with local community fundraising. So there's strong arguments for trying to retain some of those existing brands there so that volunteers still feel they've got something of what was left to work with, that they can still identify with and still feels like the charity they've always been supporting and helping. Institutional donors are less focused on brand and more focused on making their money go further, and are therefore more likely, and certainly in my experience, positively encouraging of the whole merger agenda in general. But undercutting through all of this, communications, and I think Andrew's touched on this, but a really carefully planned communication strategy. You've got to bring all these different stakeholders, the staff, the trustees, the volunteers, the supporters, the donors. We've got to bring them all together and by demonstrating to them, I guess, the business case, the merger benefits. You've got to clarify what's going to be kept confidential, because some of the stuff will need to be kept confidential. So understanding what we can communicate and what we can't communicate, but proactive communications. Rumours can kill mergers. If people know what's going on behind the scenes, there's all these meetings going on in smoke-filled rooms and we don't know what's happening, and people start getting nervous and staff start leaving because they're worried about the future, because they don't know what the future is, rather than people leaving because they can see there's a merger happening. So uncertainty doesn't help. So we've got to have clarity in that communications plan, and setting that out very clearly and having a very clear strategy on that is critical.
Gareth, there are a few questions and or comments. I just wonder whether it's worth picking them up now. First one is should fundraising be directed towards associated stakeholder interests to avoid fatigue in the public arena? Is charity governance more challenged now than at any time in previous history? And do we assume that liabilities can be overcome while assets remain steadfast? So partly questions, partly comments. My personal view is that the charity governance model is under stress. I think people are more reluctant to become charity trustees given the potential implications, and a little bit by the tone of the Charity Commission, which says you trustees are responsible, which they are, but perhaps the tone is a little frightening for some people. Just on the assets and liabilities, I mean, liabilities don't disappear, they need managing, and usually they need paying or performing. So you can manage them. I mean, assets equally need managing to ensure they produce income or capital growth, or that if they're a building they don't fall down, etc. So I think the two go hand in hand. I don't know if either Gareth or Jonathan have got any other thoughts on any of those, or
I was going to come in. I'll come in on the fundraising one, which I think is absolutely right. I mean, I think when I look at those charities that have successfully fundraised, well, actually, I think this happened. I think this was the case before the pandemic, even, but those that knew who to target. So most charities, there's a niche donor base that they go to, be it a church-based charity knowing where to go, or it's a health charity where you're targeting families that have been impacted by a particular health condition. There's always a constituency out there who are going to be more inclined to give to you than the wider public, and knowing who that is and targeting them. And technology has helped us so much has helped charities so much in targeting those benefits. So smart use of technology, knowing who that core donor base is, absolutely is helpful. And the liabilities assets question, I would just say the only thing, I'm not an insolvency practitioner, so I have to be very careful what I say here. I'm not able to give insolvency advice, but when it comes to the assets versus liabilities equation, the important thing is always back towards the timing of liabilities. So just the fact that your sum total of liabilities exceeds your assets doesn't in itself make you insolvent, or so I'm told by the insolvency people. It's around, and that phrase that Andrew used, meeting debts as they fall due. So that, if you looked at the balance sheet of many major companies, they fail that current asset liability test because they can string their creditors along for a long period of time, so they're not falling due. So yeah, that would be the only other comment I'd make on that.
Great, thank you for the questions. So moving on to the next slide, we've got on choosing the right structure, which obviously follows on from looking at some of those barriers and some of the nice diagrams that Andrew had up there. So I will talk through some of these points, and I think Andrew and Jonathan are going to jump in and we'll try and have a discussion. But to kick off, I think Jonathan wanted to say a word on the due diligence point.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's a bit of a chicken and egg, the due diligence versus the right structure, because until you know what structure you're heading for, you can't really focus your due diligence appropriately. But at the same time, the due diligence can throw up factors that would lead you to one structure or the other. So just to explain that, I suppose, I mean, if you were going to go for a merger where your charity is merging in to another charity, if you think that's the best route, or it's kind of more of the takeover, then what you're looking for is a safe place for your charity to move to. Yeah, and so your due diligence can probably arguably be a little lighter, because you're just making sure that you've got that safe place. Whereas if you were a charity assuming another organization, that was, if you're receiving the other party, then you do need to know and want to know whether there's restrictions on use of the assets. You want to know whether there's any hidden liabilities, etc. And the onus on the due diligence, I think, therefore becomes much more in depth. So the scope of due diligence might depend on the structure that you're heading to. But equally, yes, the due diligence can throw up factors that may show that actually, no, because of your pension arrangements, charity A can't be wound up without crystallizing a big debt or whatever. And the due diligence can throw those sorts of things up. So, well, actually, that option isn't a runner. So it is a bit chicken and egg. But I suppose the one thing I think what that then leads you towards is to try and rebut the assumption that the only people that benefit from mergers are the professional advisors. I think the important thing is to get the right bit of professional advice up front as to what the realistic options are, and that little bit of advice at the start before decisions are made then helps further on down the road. You have a greater clarity of the sense of direction of the merger, and with greater clarity around that, you can then focus the more in-depth due diligence. Andrew and I have shared an experience in recent times where in-depth due diligence was done, and then it transpired that there wasn't clarity amongst the two parties as to what structure they wanted at the end of it all, and that merger fell through as a result. So yeah, right professional advice at the right time, I think, can preempt a lot of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And a couple of things on our standard checklists, I suppose, that we go through. One was defined benefit pension schemes, which Jonathan mentioned. Transferring that across can equal a large liability, and therefore maybe you'd then be looking at a structural option with a parent-child arrangement, if anything at all. Another one that comes up increasingly more over the last couple of years are data protection issues. If one charity has a large and valuable supporter database, making sure that you get the data protection advice up front to see whether it's viable to actually transfer that across to another organisation, if that's what you're looking at doing, is really important. And if you will require fresh consents, for example, from all of those supporters, how much time and resource will that take, and what might the drop-off rate be, and therefore could that be something that re-informs the option that you're looking at in terms of the structure of the merger itself.
Can I in there just on the due diligence as well? I think that it's worth understanding both organisations setting a level of materiality to sort of go, we're not going to look at every single tiny thing. Let's put a broad financial number that says if this comes up, it wouldn't stop the merger. But we don't want to get the lawyers to read contracts that are worth 50 quid each. It's just not worth the money.
Yeah, absolutely. And the next point on there in terms of legal form, I think Andrew already touched on that when looking at some of the structures. So if you are two charities that are both corporate bodies, so typically company limited by guarantee and or a CIO, a charitable incorporated organisation, then all options will be available to you. But if one of the partners or both of the partners are a trust or an unincorporated association, then things like a parent-child relationship can be much more difficult and sometimes impossible because of the nature of those legal structures and their governance and their governing documents. So obviously worth considering that at the outset. Also an interesting one of the points on there is in relation to the size of the charities. I don't know if Andrew and Jonathan have found the same thing, but sometimes I think I've found, particularly when there are two very small charities or reasonably small charities, they often prefer the conceptual simplicity of just having one organisation in future and not having to worry about the fact that there are two entities and potentially cross charges and working out where different contracts and staff lie, etc., which is sometimes something that drives them towards just looking at a transfer of assets.
Yeah, I think it's the future governance and running costs of two entities, isn't it? You still got to keep them alive, prepare accounts, have board meetings, etc. So,
assumption and management of risk we've got up there. So, again, this kind of chicken and egg point with the due diligence. But if there is a concern about the level of risk or the level of liabilities in charity B, then charity A might not want to take all of that on immediately through a transfer of assets and liabilities into it. It might be more comfortable keeping the two structures separate legal entities, but having a relationship between them. For example, as Andrew mentioned, with charity A as sole member of charity B, and an agreement between them for how they'll work together, even if it's for an interim period. Sometimes we see, you adopt that structural change to start with, work together for a period of time, get a bit more of a feel for how the organizations are running and what are the assets and liabilities and how do the ops work, etc., and then move to a full transfer of assets and liabilities a little bit further down the line. Control and governance. So yes, working out whatever the new structure is, whatever the new organization or organizations are, what is the balance of power and who is making the decisions. If it's a transfer of assets, then will there be a couple of board members moving across, or more than a couple? And sometimes those discussions can be really difficult ones, actually, because if there are two charities that are basically the same size, then maybe you'd say, okay, well, 50-50 seems like a reasonable starting point for everyone. But where there's a little bit of a discrepancy and the smaller organisation wants to be sure that things are done in a certain way, they can sometimes find it difficult to get sufficient representation on the board moving forward, or sufficient assurances from the bigger organisation in any merger agreement that things will play out how they want them to, because clearly the bigger organisation doesn't want to tie its trustees' hands for years to come. So there can be some tricky political discussions around that.
Also worth thinking about the skill set as well. I think if you do get to that situation, bringing the skills audit or skills matrix out is quite helpful to sort of depersonalize the selection process.
Just in terms of membership, I don't think we've mentioned membership once, but if one of the organisations has a wider membership, working out what their views will be, consulting with them, particularly if they're also your supporters and or source of income, is clearly quite important to do it at the outset. And Jonathan's point on communication can be absolutely key if you are looking at a merger that will potentially change how you're perceived by those members. Then selling it to them from the get-go is potentially very important. Timing and costs. I think this is the scenario that you mentioned, Jonathan, with, I think you and Andrew have advised on this a few times for clients where they want to see a benefit as quickly as possible. They want to be able to justify the merger as quickly as possible. And one way of doing that potentially more quickly is to put in place a structural change, for example, a topco, or have one as the sole member of the other, and that can be achieved sometimes much more quickly and cost effectively, but it's can be difficult to talk through sometimes, and yes, see what happens.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I think once a decision has been made to do a merger, sometimes the quickest and easiest way to achieve the single operating entity, regardless of what's happening around with the legal structures, just means you can get people on board quickly. Because if they can see the immediate benefits, particularly, I suppose the most obvious thing is cost savings, but if you can see the merger benefits being realised quickly, you'll bring doubters on board, and if then more structural changes needed at the legal, in terms of legal form, that can happen subsequently, but that you can get a combined entity in some way, shape or form in place quite quickly and start, as you say, start delivering those merger benefits right up front.
So there's one quick question here. Are we seeing any combinations between charities and other legal forms, i.e. community interest companies or just unregistered companies limited by guarantee, etc.? We do. We quite often get asked to convert a KIC into a charity. The issue with doing mergers between a charity and a non-charity is that if a charity is going to transfer its assets out to another organisation that is not a registered charity, it must ensure that those assets are applied for exclusively charitable purposes in accordance with its own objects. So that can be quite difficult in a sense of how do you enforce that? If the charity is going to transfer all its assets and then wind itself up, the trustees have got to find some mechanism to say these assets will always be applied for this purpose. Now there's trust law and things like that, but if there's nobody to enforce it, that can be a bit of an issue. We've seen a couple, but not common. I've done a few mergers of KICs and things like that, but
and for those reasons, I think, well, not just those reasons, but actually the trend that I've seen is certainly charities taking over, merging with, having as subsidiaries more sort of social enterprise type structures. Every charity feeling they've got to find got to widen the scope of how they can generate income, and if they can see benefit that's supporting their charitable work in the social enterprise space, then having a social enterprise as a subsidiary and gift aiding those taxable profits up to the charity. I'm seeing more of that, certainly in that direction. If you keep the charity as the owner, as it were, you avoid the charitable ring fencing issues that Andrew talks about.
So, conscious of time, we have 3 minutes left. Jonathan, you have the sum up slide, I think. But if there are any further questions, do pop them in the chat box or the Q&A. We don't have to leave immediately at 12 o'clock, but maybe some of you do. For those of you that do, and if we're still chatting, thank you for joining us. But please stay to the end, and if you have any further questions, please pop them in the appropriate place. Jonathan.
Well, no, I mean, this is a very quick slide, really. As I said, once you've got the merger over the line, and we said you can get delivering those merger benefits, but it's you know, as it says there, the work's only just begun. I got a quote from we helped one of our clients, Send a Cow, achieve a merger a few years ago, and their finance manager gave me this quote afterwards that she said I was able to use in a public forum. She said, I asked her sort of, well, what message would you give to any other charity thinking about going through a merger? And she just said, don't underestimate how long it will take to make the changes and the level of work involved. And I think, yes, bringing two teams together, integrating systems, a new board, they're not easy things to do. But I think the lesson that I would take out of the experiences that I've seen from post-merger is get on and do it, and don't let the feeling of two different organizations that have come together, don't let that feeling persist for longer than you have to. There was another organization that was formed out of just literally slotting two organizations together side by side. They shared a name by putting their two names side by side, a bit like Click Sergeant, but they didn't do the rest of it. They didn't do anything else. And 3 years later, I went back into that organization to help them on something else. And there were still phrases like, oh, she works for blah, party B, and oh, he's from party A, and therefore he works like this. They just hadn't done that integration piece, and it just felt, they weren't working as a single team, and it didn't feel right. So you've got to get on with that bit and get on with the integration, I think, as soon as you've got the merger over the line. But it's not easy.
Well, thank you everyone for signing in thus far. We'll just stop the recording now, which we'll make available on our website and via YouTube. And then please do chip in with any questions.